Okay, so tonight we're going to have a discussion about Indonesia in crisis. And the question is, what kind of crisis? I think it's a crisis of many different dimensions, but primarily a crisis about the legitimacy of the government. We've had 2 weeks of serious protests, violence, and now with the most recent issue of Tempo, allegations that there was some involvement of people with current or past links to the TNI, the Indonesian military. Just to go over the chronology, there were 4 elements to this upheaval. First, a student-led protest on August 25th against hikes in the housing allowances of DPR, or members of parliament, who were already seen as corrupt and tone deaf and only interested in enriching themselves further. Some exceptions, but that was the general perception. Secondly, an initially peaceful worker-led protest on August 28th, in which some students joined. It was met by water cannon and police tear gas, ended with clashes between police and some of the protesters, and at 7:30 p.m., an online motorcycle driver, which are called ojols, was run over by a Barakuda, a police armed personnel carrier, that killed Affan Kurniawan, the driver. And that just triggered an eruption of anger, which was very clearly spontaneous, but very much directed against the police. This later morphed into a different kind of violence that continued through the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th, involving the burning of DPR Day, or local government buildings, in 5 different cities, I think, and also the looting of the homes of some parliamentarians and the Minister of Finance. And some of that violence appears, at least according to the Tempo article, to have been coordinated. 10 people died, more than 1,000 people were arrested, although many of them will probably be released. And some of the civil society activists are still in detention. We'll hear more about that from Pa Isnur. So tonight, our speakers and discussants are going to address, I think they are anyway, 5 different questions. First is, how should we interpret what happened? Was this primarily an explosion of economic grievances against elite privilege? And as such, what are its antecedents? Ed can talk about that. And will it continue? Was it part of a cycle of protest and repression that is linked to the steady decline in Indonesian democracy? And will this only get worse? Was it directed against Prabowo, against the government, against the economy in general, or all of the above? And, or we could say, or, in the most optimistic interpretation, does it signal an important break in the political complacency of the Indonesian public, and perhaps a sign that from the bottom up, reformasi can get back on track? Second question is, who benefits? Is there anyone in the Indonesian elite who gains from the violence or the specter of instability? And how do intra-elite divisions play into this, particularly police versus military, Jokowi versus Prabowo, and so on? Third, what are the immediate and longer-term consequences of this? We'll hear some of the immediate consequences from Pa Isnur, but the protesters want a change in the DPR. They want police reform, legal reform, more government accountability, academic freedom, more protections of civil liberties. How do these protests get us closer to those goals? Fourth, what didn't happen that we might have expected? One welcome thing that didn't happen was anything linked to race, ethnicity, or religion. And I think it's important to understand how important it is that so far that hasn't happened. And finally, and perhaps most important, what has to happen for the disparate groups involved in what's effectively a leaderless protest to turn themselves into a social movement with clear and achievable goals? And how do you keep the momentum up without other parties moving to exploit it? So to discuss this and other questions, we have Ed Aspinall, Professor of Political Science and Social Change at ANU. And Ed, I went back and I read Opposing Suharto, one of his first books, and it's amazing how relevant that is to what's going on now. We have Pa Isnur, who's chair of Yayasan El Beha and following very closely the aspects of repression that we've seen in the last few weeks. We have Amalinda Savirani of the Social and Political Science faculty at UGM, who focuses on urban studies and the urban poor. And we have Dr. Rina Mardiana from IPB Bogor, who also represents the Indonesian Caucus for Academic Freedom, but studies land and agrarian conflict. And then as discussants, we have Veronica Kusumaryati from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, a social anthropologist looking at indigenous politics and conflict, as well as racism, gender, and social media, if you want to add a lot to the pot. We have Chris Hulshaw from the University of Wisconsin from the Department of History, whose specialty is foundations of global hegemony during the Cold War. And we have Doreen Lee, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Northeastern University, who looks at youth culture and grassroots expressions of resistance. So Ed, over to you for about 6 minutes, and we'll give Doreen a chance to comment briefly on yours, and you'll have a chance to respond equally briefly before we move on to the next.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sydney, and thanks very much to all the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak. So I wrote a new Mandala post on this last week, and I won't go much further than that post in these brief conversations today. And I'll start by saying something that Sydney already alluded to, that the thing that really strikes me about this wave of protests is all the similarities with 98, that it does seem to be the episode of social and political protest that is most similar to the movement of that time that we've experienced in the post-Reformasi era. And some of the similarities are really obvious, like the backdrop of economic hardship, which I think everyone would agree has been an important part of this protest and partly explains the involvement of groups like online motorcycle taxi drivers, high school students, and so on. The other thing is the rapid spread of the rioting. I mean, even much faster this time compared to 98, facilitated above all, I guess, by social media. The fact that security force violence really caused the protest to escalate rather than to recede, which very famously, of course, in May 98, that happened after the killing of the Tri Sakti students. And similarly, we saw a similar dynamic this time. And even as we've seen over the last few days, this dominant narrative emerging again, which Sydney referred to, that one way to understand the violence is to think of this as a episode of provocation, that there are shadowy figures involved. Well, not so shadowy this time, actually, because the accusations are being made very directly that it's military intelligence. And that this is one way we can understand what's going on. I mean, I'm often very skeptical about those sorts of frames for understanding episodes of mass unrest in Indonesia, because so often they don't have a lot of basis to them. But this time, I mean, this is something we need to come back and discuss, I think. This time it does seem, at least in a couple of instances, that there is a bit more evidence. But the thing which really strikes me as the major similarity is just this sort of yawning gap of miscomprehension between the two worlds, and this development of a subculture of protests that we've seen in Indonesia over the last few years. This definitely isn't the first such wave of protest. It's at least the fifth large wave of youth or student-led protests we've seen since 2019. And with that, you have this whole sort of diffuse network of organizations and action groups and online organizing and all the rest of it, labor unions, student executive councils, these very flexible and informal networks. You have that world on the one hand, so this world of the protesters with their developing critique of the current economic and social order. And on the other hand, you have this world of official politics who seemed, at least initially, to be completely out of their depth in terms of understanding what was happening and being able to respond effectively. Most dramatically summed up, I think, in Ahmad Saroni, the DPR member's comments calling the protesters the stupidest people in the world, on earth, and then it ends up that his house gets sacked, of course, partly as a response to that. So what I would say, though, is that the difference now is that we see this gap partly being sort of developing over the last 20 years of Indonesian democratization as a result of a pattern of informal politics that have grown up around elections, that DPR members and other elected officials in Indonesia have become products of this really deeply entrenched system of money politics and clientelism, and they themselves are trapped in a kind of collective action problem. Like 10 years or so ago, when I first did research on this topic, a lot of DPR members would sort of, vent or complain about how they themselves didn't want to be investing so much money in vote buying and other patterns of behavior. That they couldn't escape it, though, that there was the only choice that they had as a means of getting elected. But now we see, of course, as a product of that system becoming more and more entrenched, that there's a sort of filtering process going on in the political elite, that it's only the wealthiest candidates, those who have dynastic connections, etc., who get elected. And so you have this sort of gulf opening up much more widely than previously between elected representatives and the people who are in this growing subculture. So the problem, I think, and this is the one I think one of the issues we need to wrestle with in this webinar, is that it's just very difficult to break out of one of these sorts of collective action, informal politics traps of the kind that we've seen Indonesian democracy develop into. The problem is not so much that of course there are particular formal laws, regulations, political structures, patterns of behavior that the protesters oppose, and many of them are embodied in this list of 17 plus 8 demands that have been sort of formalized over the last few days. But above all, what they're opposed to are these informal networks and patterns of power that infuse all of the major political institutions at this time. And I guess that's the big difference that I see, that the goals of the anti-Suharto movement were so concrete, so focused on overthrowing Suharto, that it's much harder, in fact, to formulate an equivalently effective set of goals this time around. The external jolt of the protests, I'm sure, will have some sort of a role in bringing back to the political agenda some of these issues to do with political reform, fighting corruption, and so on. But I think the biggest problem that these progressive or protest movements have faced in Indonesia during the Reformasi period is still their relative inability to make a breakthrough themselves in the electoral arena. The fact that elections themselves are so dominated by these patterns of money politics and clientelism and programmatic politics of any kind, let alone the sort of progressive politics we see emerging out of protest movements in countries like Thailand, for example, have yet to find a really secure place in Indonesia's electoral arena. And I think that's the sort of the big challenge that this movement will face going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very
That's
much.
it from me.
Thank you. Doreen, do you want to give a brief comment? And Ed, you can respond.
Thank you for that, Ed. That was really helpful, I think. Systematic overview of some of the core similarities at a glance between what happened in 1998 and the present. But I'm really also interested in how you've diagnosed the problem as elections themselves driving a kind of very general political culture of corruption, right, and patronage that's very hard to break out of. And at the same time, what we're hearing from a lot of Indonesians who are appearing all over the news and on foreign news channels or doing their own talk shows and podcasts is that they are, in general, so disenchanted of any kind of state institutions that they choose not to pursue that path. So on the one hand, you have, let's say, the inefficacy of state institutions or democratic institutions. And on the other hand, you also have distrust, a general distrust among the Indonesian population.
Thank you.
I wonder if you can just give a few thoughts or comments about this impasse, because I think your sort of ambivalence about, how does a movement then repackage itself into articulate goals that are actionable, and whether or not that's feasible for the people who are kind of trying out their voice for the first time, but also in general not trusting the institutions to enact them.
Thank you.
Straight back to me.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Doreen. And I think impasse is sort of the right word, I feel, because I think part of that sort of cycle we see in Indonesian politics in which, the population sort of loses trust or loses faith in political institutions and in politicians, and that they then, use elections as an opportunity to get some sort of immediate material advantage, and that then fuels the sort of the money cycle, the money politics cycle that then deepens people's disillusionment. I mean, I think that is the problem. That is part of the problem, that there is this widespread view amongst many of the sort of the activists who are involved in these street processes that politics is almost irrevocably a sort of a dirty domain, that that it's sort of irredeemably stained. And there's a lot of but they have a lot of reasons for thinking that way, right? I mean, in the past, there was this sort of strategy amongst many of the civil society or NGO activists that to the extent that they would enter into politics, they would do so in this very fragmented sort of manner, and various individuals went into different sorts of political parties and tried to effectuate change from within. But the result was that largely they were swamped, once they found themselves in that situation, and that once they confront expectations of their voters themselves, who become habituated in this new pattern of highly exchange-based elections, that they themselves often had to adapt. And I think everyone can think of, individual stories of how that happened. So it is a sort of a cycle. It is an impasse, and there is a sort of that sort of, collective action problem where it does need an external shock to break out of that sort of a trap, I think. And the question is whether this particular shock is going to be big enough to achieve that, to somehow, as the phrase goes, to reset the direction of Indonesian politics. But I think eventually that will need some sort of new form of electoral intervention, that's that bridging the gap between the worlds of street politics, activist politics, and electoral politics is still the sort of the missing piece of the puzzle in Indonesian politics. So I don't feel like, all right, I'll leave it at that. Wasn't a very effective answer.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to Pa Isnur from Yayasan LBH. And Pa Isnur, you have 6 minutes, and then we'll have a similar response. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney. Yeah, I agree with Edward's statement and would like to add to what Edward said. In this crisis, basis and belief that Indonesia is currently in a state of national leadership vacuum, which is incompetence leader. The following facts are indisputable. The first is the police force is paralyzed and no longer capable of performing its basic function of maintaining order and security. The second, the president has allowed looting, destruction, and burning of police station and legislative buildings in Paris regions. The third is the president and the vice president have failed to show leadership. Yeah, in the midst of this crisis, both of them have been absent from a public sphere and have not provided any real direction to the people. Exclude police and military to repression. Yeah. Other leaders such as those of in-house representative, the People's Consultative Assembly and Regional Representative Council also silent. Yeah, very slow to respond, and with no one properly addressing the demands of the people voiced through demonstration. The question is why. In our opinion, this is an accumulation of many previous problem. Yeah. The first is also, yeah, we know continuing of legacy of a severely low system and circumstance from the Jokowi administration. But the Prabowo also administration has a major problem with legitimacy. Yes, with a history of human rights violation in kidnapping cases, a vice president who is facing charge of ethical violation by constitutional court judge who changed regulation to get Gibran elected, and strong of finding of bias and the mobilization of state apparatus in the election. In 10 months of Prabowo office, we see the problem is the first, the placement of mobilization of military in numerous public position. Yeah, state under enterprise, overseeing development project, including food asset project, free meals for student projects, many ways military present. Yeah, and the second is the bloated and chaotic cabinet transition has caused many problems, not only in the budget, but also in coordination and programs, including many cases of dual position that violate the constitutional court's ruling. Also, the ambitious project that require massive budget reallocation and deplete fund from the other basic needs. As a result of this reallocation, the budget allocated to local government has dropped drastically. Even though local government heavily rely on a fund from the central government, and the open chaos of government failures that anger the people continue to occur in succession. Yeah, and Prabowo stumble to resolve them. For example, the increase of VAT, gas shortcut for the people, the blocking of tens million of bank accounts, the granting of amnesty to convince the corruptor, drastic increase in the land and building tax in many regions, and also the including attempts to bury and whitewash past human rights violation in the first day, from the first day. So, yeah, during the crisis in August, we saw how the president, the chief of police, and the speaker of DPR misunderstood the problem and acted brutal towards citizen. As in 5 September, YLBJ and LBH offices recorded at least 3,337 people arrested, 1,042 people injured and rushed to the hospital, and to the death, dozens of people have been named as a suspect, including activists who have been critical but arrested for incitement and provocation. Contrast also reported that there are people who are still missing to this day, 2 until 7. And SafeNet also reported that serious violation of the right to information have been committed. Internet shutdown, the shutdown of live social media services, even doxing and digital intimidation of democracy activists. It's happened to me. My number blasting to the people through WhatsApp media, and the people thinking my number is Eco Patrio number. So I received hundreds of message from the people. They are angry with me. Until now, still happen. And YLBI and civil society movement tried to take action since the maybe second day, and respond quickly by providing assistance to the victim and violence and arrest. Yeah. And the last is there were many oddities in this riot, and allegation of military involvement in the riots began to be raised by our investigation, also by the media. Thank you, Sydney.
Thank you very much. That was a great summary of some of the problems of legitimacy in the Prabowo administration, not just the Jokowi administration that preceded it, and the issues of the way that the police have become politicized and the direct consequences of all of these arrests and repression more generally. Chris, do you have a comment on Isnur's presentation?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Isnur. That was really informative and helpful. So in your comments, you mentioned the silences and the slow responses from the administration and members of the DPR, and that they may have misunderstood the issues. And I see this in the media broadly, that the administration is not quite understanding what the people want. And I want to pose a question. Perhaps it's not fair as you're in country and sometimes. So please, if I'm asking something that you cannot answer, please do not. But is it possible that the administration and the powers that be very much do understand more than we're giving them credit for, as we see the slow chipping away at democratic freedoms, increase of authoritarianism, and remilitarization, politicization of the police force? Is it possible that they are just being more meticulous with their response and able to start to utilize some of the maneuvers that they put into place to see how far they can go prior to continuing that process of chipping away?
Thank you
And
very much.
apologize if that's not fair to ask from where you're sitting.
No, so do you have a quick response to that, Isnur?
Yeah. For example, after crisis, the action from the House of Representatives and the political party is just not active, giving not active for several number of parliament member, and decreasing the number of their allowance. But the problem relating to the policy. So what happened to the policy? What happened to the customarily people law? What happened to the criminal code of law? What happened to the omnibus law? The people angry not only about the person, not only about the Saroni and Uyakuya and other. We see the big problem is political system. So they don't mention about the political system, not mention about the corruption, not mention about the perampasan aset, drafting of law. So it's the big problem for also Prabowo. Until now, the Prabowo not mentioned about I'm in need of forgive from the people. So the Prabowo still mention about the problem is terrorism and makar. Apa ya makar tuh in English? Rebellion. So the police after Prabowo direction, the police more brutal in the field. The day after Prabowo instruction, 2 campus in Bandung attacked by the police with the tear gas and water cannon. So we see the government wrong acknowledgement the problem. I think the big problem is also come from the parliament member. Yes, I agree.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we'll come back in the broader discussion to some of these issues of militarization and police. Now I want to turn to Bu Amalinda Savirani at UGM for a brief presentation.
Thank you, Sydney, and hello, everyone. Also, thank you for the organizer. You mentioned your last point about militarizations and the return to new order, episode 2. I think that's also what worries me much, because, I mean, as Isnur and Ed mentioned, I think the core of the problem is corruption, and also inequality that getting spread and widening. So I think the president knows that also the problem, but the fact is he keep continue making a policy, issuing a policy that has nothing to do with that two problem, inequality and that's, for me, is a question why, right? Why he keep going and why he become ignorant from whatever civil society organizations or public and citizens demand. So far, 10 months since he was inaugurated, nothing really like strong gesture or strong policy showing that he wants to deal with that two main issues. And personally, I'm grateful that we are basically returned to this new order episode 2 in terms of, as you mentioned in the when you opening the discussion, who benefit from not from the riot, not from the demonstration, but from the policy so far. The free lunch program, the cooperative red and white, that's all using these infrastructures of the military. So that's really become questions why if he actually planning to that direction or this regime, right? And that's explained to me why he's never say even sorry that Mas Isnur had mentioned. It seems he doesn't think it is really he doesn't think it's really a problem, because looking from the way he responds to it. Also, he keep changing the policy. At once he visiting Affan Kurniawan, the late Affan Kurniawan, to his house, pay his condolence. But at the same time, he said that let's promote police who are being beaten on the street. So that's really kind of worry me, and maybe we can discuss that more. But also at the same time, we can really the political or the international atmosphere is really changing too. That's really different from 1998. The type of populism and anti-democratic, and the US also shows an example, right? That's really kind of common everywhere. So something happened with Mas Isnur, for instance, it's really difficult to really mobilize the international support. Well, it's still there, but it's getting shrinking. We also witnessed at the same time the situation, the constraining situation from the international perspective as well. And that's also really another worry because the trend of donors going declining globally and on the human rights as well. And that's really become a kind of constraint for keep pushing the democratic agenda. And my last point is that from the civil society itself, I can see at this right that the demand is very much not really focused on targeted one like we have in 1998, corruption, KKN or corruption and the throw of Suharto, right? Now we have so many things because so many layers of a problem, and that can really confusing for the public and for the civil society demand as well. But we also see this change of generations, right? From my generation or Mas Isnur generation to younger generation, and that sociologically speaking, it's changing. They also use different type of strategies. So we don't know anything about influencer at that time, but they are the one who are now play important role in mobilizing support or mobilize awareness from the citizens, from the just ordinary citizen, that every day they experience this inequality. Every day they need to move away from the main street just for the elite to pass through with the with this type of special vehicle. That's the type of grievances that become really consolidated, and I think that's younger generation cannot actually we can support each other and become a more massive movement. I think that's
Thank you very much. Because I think that's a very important point about the difference in the international climate this time as opposed to 1998. And also, I mean, your specialty is the urban poor in a way, and they're such a critical part of this movement, and how to harness that energy is something that we can talk about more in the general discussion. Veronica, do you have any comments that you want to give back to Amalinda?
Thank you so much for that. I think I have that's a very, very wonderful analysis on how this movement or the protest that came about. I have two questions. First is that the symbol of this protest is Affan Kurniawan. So it represents something that's quite different from like 1998 in a sense that it's not factory workers, it's not buruh in the traditional sense of like factory workers or Marxist, work labor, but it's like a new class of precariat. And considering like your research on the urban poor, maybe you can explain a little bit more about the emergence of this precariat in the urban context in Indonesia and how they are become radicalized in so many cities. And second, I think the international context also in regard to the role of transnational or international media platform like TikTok or even Sophie, where protests were shut down on live on TikTok, but then it moved to Sophie. Maybe you can tell a little bit more about that, technological aspect of that protest that I think is quite very, very interesting in comparison to the 1998 protest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have a comment, particularly on the social media part, that you can respond to Veronica on?
Yeah, thank you, Mbak Vero. Yes, what also very much stand out from this recent protest is the use of social media, and that's quite a lot. A lot means every day, you can just spending your time scrolling and sharing. That's actually what citizens doing now. And on this platform is very much any platform actually. And also that's different from between among generation. Facebook for this X, this Gen Z using Instagram and TikTok, and they are basically complement to each other. But when you're saying that, so they can just find ways when TikTok shut down, they just move to any possibilities of doing the same thing. So I guess this is what this kind of enabling factors that kind of consolidate this movement among the young people. So I guess that's really important. But can I address this first question, Sydney?
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess what we can also identify from this movement is, as I mentioned, the everydayness, Mbak Vero. So like the color it's now being popular, the green and the pink, that's also basically expression or color of the oppressed or color of this marginal group. First, the green one is the ojol jacket, and the second is the pink one is the mother or women very brave facing this police barricade. So in a way, the symbol shows its inequality, right? And that's mostly experienced by these people in the urban area. That's really every day, traffic jam, limitation of public transport. That I'm saying that the other group in the provincial town or the rural, but it's a different type of grievances. It's different types. So it's really kind of day that you can kind of face every day, like this long traffic jam at TB Simatupang. You just try to be, sane. And that's really kind of this kind of urban bias type of problem that is being addressed. And then, the ojol is a representation for these urban activities where it's basically killed. And everybody who rely on this transportation or rely on this service feels really heartbroken. Everybody was just crying looking at this very short footage. So I guess what I can respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's turn now to Rina and have her perspective as a representative of the Indonesian Caucus for Academic Freedom, but you can use any of your other hats as well, Rina.
Okay, thank you, Sydney. Yeah, based on the presenters of all the speakers earlier, the social exploration spreading in recent time is not an anomaly. It is the logical consequences of policies that look empirical on paper, yet neglect aspirations, justice, and participations. When public protest is met with silencing, including on campuses, that is not mere mismanagement. It is an early indicator of a state on the path to failure. In many places, national strategic projects are executed under a logical acceleration, deadlines, output, and numbers, while sidelining affected communities. The Rempang case in Riau islands lays this pattern bare. Residents' protests were answered with force, tear gas, and arrest. The trauma even reached into schools. Development premised on coercion corrodes the two most vital assets of the states, trust and legitimacy. Once trust collapses, every subsequent policy, even the good ones, will be read as a threat, not a solution. And since the omnibus law was passed, waves of implementing regulation has tended to ease the expansion of concessions, the release of forest areas and extractive practices, while agrarian conflict are left to smolder. In many locales, from Wadas in Purworejo Regency to customary village around mining sites, people feel their right to a livelihood is being negotiated without them. This is when law moves faster than justice. Legal instruments pave the way for projects but fail to erect adequate social and environmental safeguard. The accumulation of such justice become fuel waiting to ignite. The expansion of the military rules through the reserves component or COMCHAT and the placement of active or retired officer in strategic civilian force shift the boundaries of democracy built after reformasi. More worrying, still critic of this expansion rule is often met with intimidations. An opinion writer was sideswiped by unknown assailants on a motorcycle. Student challenging policies were visited by territorial officers for data collections. It is not only action that shift public reasoning shift as well. This agreement is treated as a threat rather than a vitamin for policy. This rekindles the shadow of the dual function doctrine we call dwifungsi as a new guess. Advocacy data show a surge in arbitrary arrest of demonstrators and activists in recent years. Online verbal catch-all provisions we call in bahasa pasal karet, especially the ITE law, has become multi-purpose nets for targeting critics. On campuses, discussions are disbanded, student media shuttered, and outspoken lecturer and researchers intimidated. This is not a peripheral issue. Academic freedom is a barometer of the health of a rule of law state. When it is obstructures, a nation's capacity for self-correction goes numb. At this point, we are no longer talking about procedural defects. We are confronting a systematic listening deficit. When channel of deliberation jam, grievance accumulate, a small spark, say, talk of levies allowance for official amidst the rising cost of living is enough to ignite social fury. Tragedies in the streets, including the death of an online motorcycle taxi or we call ojek online driver during a protest, accelerate acceleration into widespread unrest. Casualties among thousands are arrested and the spinal of resentment deepens. The August-September 2025 explosion was not spontaneity. It was the cause of a long-ignored accumulation of injustice. A state
Thank you.
that refused to listen was ultimately forced to listen by turmoil. A state function not only by its capacity to cause, but its capacity to listen, to mediate conflict, protect right, and recognize the dignity of its citizens. When peaceful protest is criminalized, academic critique is feared, and community objections to project are dismissed as disruption. The state fails at its most basic function. Ensuring policy is grounded in informed consent and respect for right. put differently.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and finally, let me say this: we do not lack data, studies, or evidence. What we'll lack is the will to listen and the humility to correct course when the public calls attention to error. Without that, every physical achievement will be only bought with a legitimacy deficit. And when legitimacy erodes, repression might appear tempting, but it will only deepen the crisis and drag the state closer to failure. So listening is the most sensible policy today, not because it's sentimental, it's because it is rational and life-saving. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Chris has a quick comment on your presentation, and then we'll move. We have a number of very good questions in the Q&A. So Chris, a quick comment, and then we'll move to the other questions.
Yeah, very briefly, I really appreciated that segue from Amalinda's wonderful ending comments on the urban nature of the protests, moving into your early comments about the more rural aspects of discontent. And I just wonder if you could briefly possibly present a way which this movement could really, as Sydney asked with her fifth question at the beginning, kind of bridge that gap and create a possibility between the rural and the urban to move forward, to create something more tangible and usable to actually make change.
And Chris, I'm going to extend that question to all of the speakers, not just Ibu Rina, but I'd like to hear anybody else who wants to comment on how do you bridge that, because there are actually a lot of divisions to bridge. That's one, but there are a lot of other cleavages that also need to happen if you're going to have an organized social movement. Ibu Rina, do you want to answer, or do you want to open it to other people?
Yeah, just quickly to respond to Chris and also to add earlier, I guess that these two words, as you rightly said, Sydney, it's just happening quite in many ways, like rural, urban. They have also different type of issues that they are dealing with. The pressure is also different, and we have this generation, young and old, you know. And we are basically witnessing now among the civil society movement that the people or the influencer are accused to steal the stage, you know, and then the older generation feel like behind and left out. And you know, this generation issues, special issues, as also as said before, this formal, informal, you know, that's all need bridges. And then I think this is also the main homework among the Indonesian system, that we don't have this always the deficiencies, and that's really interesting to see how we can, you know, establish the bridge, at least from the generation point of view. I think it's already kind of through, at least through social media, warga jaga warga, or citizens, that's also a way of, we have this common ground that we are basically aiming the same thing. So let's get together. So that kind of thing still so far have to be mended. But the structural issues, you know, like rich and poor, that's really difficult. It depends. And what, again, when you open the question, the discussion about who get benefit, so that's how it's really basically war about among these two groups. That's really hard to bridge. I think that's my short comment.
It actually it relates to one of the questions online, and maybe Ed, you can take this riffing off Amalinda's comments here, but basically, one of the audience members wants to know if there really is a crisis that's going to last, or is everything going to go back to normal as it was before? And if the momentum is already being lost before any of the demands from the protesters are accommodated, what's the solution? What do you do? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that, yeah, I mean, I feel that we're in a moment or a period now of Indonesia where we might be in a sort of a phase of recurrent crisis, actually, that we've seen this now over the last few years. And I think it's partly to do with some of the sort of the economic shifts which came in the post-COVID world, the shift to mass scale casualization of even previously formal workforce, the sort of, some of the other, the economic difficulties that are occurring for some of the sort of social sectors that Linda and others have been talking around. Plus, on top of that, this sort of deep, entrenchment of this politics of patronage and so on within the political class that we've already seen over the last 5-6 years, that we're in this period of sort of recurrent waves of crisis that don't really ever seem to be fully resolved, that there's some sort of minor concessions, and we've seen this time around, but there's neither the sufficient sort of push from below or the capacity within the political elite to produce the sort of systemic changes that we could see a clear resolution. So I think my gut feeling is we are in for a period of sort of disorientation as Indonesia sort of searches for some sort of a new sort of a format and a new set of political forces that can seek a way out of what Doreen called this sort of impasse we're in at the moment. So that's not a very optimistic sort of take on things, but I feel that we are moving into this period of protracted crisis, impasse, where the pathway out is not yet quite clear.
And also you have a completely unresponsive leadership, as several people have mentioned, where they're either absent or silent or not providing any kind of response to what they see on the streets. Let me go to Isnur. What do you think about any potential to keep the momentum going in a way that could bridge some of these divides?
Yeah, thank you, Sydney. In the early hours, of the 29 August, troops, soldiers were deployed and mass to occupy and securing the city. So the situation had escalated since August 30, with demonstration in several places that were peaceful at first, but not massive. Yeah, in this situation, the activists and NGO have a meeting and trying to the escalation again to push the changing, because the government and the prime member not responding to 17 and plus 8 campaign, demanding from the people. With the scandal of violence and looting, people became afraid, and the government had a legitimacy to become increasingly repressive. What I mentioned before. There have been also racial threats on social media, which have caused tremendous fear for a lot of people, even for the Tionghoa people. Yeah, so. And the question from also Nathaniel, regarding movement between countries, I think we learn from and support each other. What happened in Hong Kong and Taiwan, in Philippines, Indonesian activists learn from, and vice versa. They also learn from us, And now a lot of BEM, students activists trying to communicate each other and trying to push to the government and the parliament to receiving the demanding from the people. So we're trying to continuing our public campaign. For example, in the last week, we have a huge meeting in Taman Ismail Marzuki. So a lot of artists loudly speak and openly speak in that area. Thank you, Sydney.
Let me ask Veronica, we can come back to this idea of how you make the goals more achievable, but I want to pick up on your reference to Nathaniel's question. And one of the aspects to his question is, why haven't we seen more involvement of indigenous peoples or West Papuans or other marginalized communities in these protests? Is it because it's a more class-based movement? Is it because it's a more urban movement? Is it because it's easier to mobilize these people? Why have certain groups been excluded? Maybe you can take that, Veronica.
Thank you for the question. I think it's the question of like press coverage. I think most of the press coverage focus on Jakarta, but if you see the geography of the protest itself, themselves, they spread all over the country, especially even in places like Borneo, which was our Kalimantan, that is not famous for protests. But in the case of West Papua, I think I can say certainly that in Sorong, there has been also protests against the police brutality and the transfer of Papuan prisoners to outside island. But nothing to do with the DPR, with the DPR protest. So I think we have to see the need to include everyone. Maybe is not always a correct way to understand what's going on the ground. But I think it's very clear in the urban area, in places like Java and like Sumatra, like for instance North Sumatra, there's been a resentment against the system, not only the government system, but also tax, for instance, in some rural areas in Central Java. So tax-based protests also apparent here. I think if you think about the Chinese, I think the question about the Chinese is very interesting because we see less sentiment against the Chinese, and I think that's precisely because there is this new class formation, especially with the emergence of this precariat class, the motorbike driver or ojek, that have become an important force in the protest, just because it's not really clear that the Chinese control that platform, for instance, or control the tax, for instance, the increase of the tax. They see people like Sri Mulyani and all the DPR members on social media. And I think it is very wrong to assume that rural people, indigenous people, are not involved in the protest because they have been protesting against PSN or what's called the National Proyek Strategis Nasional. So the Proyek Strategis Nasional spread in at least 10 areas in Indonesia. And for instance, in Merauke, in West Papua, there have been a lot of protests against Prabowo. And Prabowo gave the medal to Haji Isan. So it's really, the elite attitude really represent this, the building of a system that's corrupt, that's nepotist, that doesn't care about the ordinary people. So I think it's really wrong if you just pay attention to the urban areas, but don't see a lot of protests in places like North Sumatra, rural areas in North Sumatra, or in West Papua. Even though West Papua is a kind of colony, so it has a different type of protest, different aspiration than their counterpart, for instance, in Sulawesi.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the real answer. We have conflicts and protests all over Indonesia. The fact that they didn't take part in this particular one is not an indication of satisfaction in any way with the current status quo. And of course, in Papua, it's a completely different set of issues. One other aspect of Nathaniel's question is that there's been so much interest, particularly in the Philippines, but also in Nepal on what's happening in Indonesia. Is there any possibility or likelihood of transnational collaboration? I think I know the answer because most transnational movements don't work all that well. But do you have any thoughts on this? Anybody? Linda or Rina or Isnur?
Sydney.
Ed?
The
Yeah.
interesting point is when we are opening the donation from whole country Indonesia, but we also receiving support from the Korea, from the Hong Kong, from Taiwan. So the Taiwanese, the Hong Kongese send the medical tools, the pharmacy, and other support from a whole country.
Wow, interesting.
Interesting,
Yeah.
yeah. So when we are receiving from the Grab, from the Gojek, which people from South Korea, from the Taiwan? Interesting, I think.
Yeah. Doreen, any comments?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that thread about what does it mean to have this level of so-called foreign influence, right? Which is just ordinary people using platforms in creative ways to support protests around the world. The Korean one is interesting because the recent wave of protests in Korea also saw the system where people who couldn't do frontline protests would do logistics, right? Would support by buying food and drink and so on. And I think it's these tactics that's spreading through Southeast Asia right now with what is it, the sea links, right? And the seedlings that they've made up to sort of give it a kind of ASEAN regional character that is very possible. I also would like to note that, you know, a lot of what people are interested in talking about is the diaspora, which is a very new concept for Indonesia, that they would even recognize a diaspora. And I think that's just really in the last 10 years that they thought of the diaspora as still connected instead of, you know, leaving the homeland and never coming back. And so what we see as a sort of wave of protests in Berlin, in New York, in DC, in Melbourne, in Geneva is really interesting, not just as a sign of solidarity, but to reinforce this idea that the rakyat is everywhere and they are really digitally aware. So the fact that people, for example, in Australia, got footage of the member of parliament who was on a junket, right, and running a marathon, is one of these examples where you start to realize social media communication and the kind of digital tracking that people are able to do as a countermeasure to the digital surveillance that they actually kind of experience every day under this regime.
Thank you. Ed, we have one for you, I think. And maybe this is for Isnur too. This is from one of our Burmese colleagues. Is there any potential for Indonesia to return back to military rule as in Myanmar?
All right. So I think the prospects of a really, like in the immediate term, a really dramatic return to military rule on the model of the Myanmar coup is very unlikely. And I think we're just a long way away from being at the sort of crisis point which would precipitate such an event. But I think the much more real threat here is this sort of creeping remilitarization that people like Linda and others have talked about, that has already advanced quite a long way, actually, that things, you know, that military roles that had really been you know, considered beyond the pale in the early Reformasi period have been renormalized. And we're seeing that much more, such as through the whole Prabowo food sovereignty move with the establishment of these food estates and cooperatives and so on, much of which is really being led by military people, often, in fact, people with Kopassus backgrounds. So I think in the immediate term, that's the sort of the much more sort of likely scenario, and in fact, it's already underway. I mean, I guess the bigger question is if, you know, if there was a much larger scale crisis, you know, we can already see signs of military positioning vis-a-vis the police and so on. I think the current context is more for this sort of jockeying for greater influence within the existing political regime. But I don't think we are in a situation anymore where we can say that a return to a much, much more militarized system of government in Indonesia is completely out of the question. Like, we would have said that, you know, much earlier in Reformasi. But I think we are moving back towards a situation where, should these sorts of crises recur? Should the protest movement not be able to develop the sort of institutional and political infrastructure in order to really take the lead? You know, you can't rule out that sort of development in the future, I think.
I think
But it's not the likeliest, right? I mean, it's not the immediate, I'm not talking about the immediate future.
And in the tempo discussion, there was a reference to a draft for martial law that was on the table, but was rejected out of hand by members of the DPR. So in that sense, it's not impossible.
Yeah, exactly. Those sorts of scenarios, you know, are becoming much more unimaginable than they were even 5 years ago.
Yeah, we had a Philippine participant here, Twinkle Mangi, who wanted to make some comparisons with the Philippines. Do you want to put your question in the Q&A, Twinkle? I don't know how to call on you from here. Try to put, pardon?
I will add Edward there.
Okay, yeah.
During the demonstration, it's kind of different, but the military, they try to win the sympathy of the people by being present in the middle of the crowd. They are handing out money to the people and acting like heroes, protecting them from police violence. So I think it's might be different with from Myanmar. Here it's like more sophisticated. They occupy position in many public position, civil position smoothly. For example, in deforestation agenda, they hand in hand with the Attorney General offices like that. So it's different without the coup d'etat like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to have any comments on the TNI law?
Yeah, so the TNI law is quite problematic. I think in a large part, and if I can kind of bridge this back to our discussion on what can foreigners do, people on the outside, particularly those in academia, I think what we can do to help and that we should focus on is giving a more tangible pathway to say the people of Indonesia have the 17 and 8 demands, and they're very generally spoken. We want A, B, and C, but there's not a direct pathway of how to get there. And there's certain things that have happened in the past in this creeping remilitarization of the country and institutionalization of corruption, where those of us who are in tune with the history of the country can give credence to those demands in a more actionable manner. So for an example, National Law 3 of 2025 back in March was passed that essentially reformed the old law number 34 of 2004, right? That ended refungee, kind of curtailed military power. And it did a number of things, which included opening up very strategic civilian positions to active duty military officers. It also opened up a number of non-war operations for the military, such as acting as an internal police force, right? And this combined with older laws from 1997 that allows the military to basically have impunity for breaking the law, as they would be investigated by military investigators and through military tribunal. You have very tangible legal methods for the system to come to power creepingly, slowly over time. And the people in Indonesia, they clearly have very, in my opinion, reasonable requests, but they lack that direct, like exactly how do we get to what we want, right? Something like we need to reform that law, right?
We have another question that gets right at this question of what do we do and how do we get there? The questioner says, in many backsliding countries, such as in Poland or Brazil, a democratic U-turn, that is going back to democracy from authoritarianism, was possible because there was an opposition party or politician who then became a rallying point for civil society. So this is a question to Indonesians in particular. Is there someone that you see as playing that role? Is there a person or persons that can be the rallying point for getting a return to democracy together? Let me ask you, Linda and Rina, and then we can ask the others as well.
Yeah, that's a very important and critical question, Sydney, that I also ask myself looking at these street demonstrations. I mean, things really different now compared to 1998. We have very much national figures that we are look up, and we have our hope on them. Now it's very much horizontally, everybody's very strong. Like so many local figures that not really like the way our politicians in 1998, right? It's really a different sense. I mean, there are so many things that difference in the way I see this protest. I want to get back to Doreen point that even solidarity is from the international community is really different. Not like the way IMF or human rights try to movement push government, but it's citizens to citizens, right? So this is kind of citizens network out of pity and out of solidarity that happening now that we are witnessing. The same with this leader. We kind of have this leaderless type of leaderless in a sense, like not really like strong leader situations now, and that make it really difficult to kind of put them as a hub, like taking everything and then express them the demand. Jogja perhaps in the coming days will have this type of street demonstration, but with the Sultan of Yogyakarta will be the one that kind of lead, but it's still on progress now, the preparation. But looking from this society, civil society organization, it's very much leaderless, and the thing is whether it is enough or not to to push this agenda through this formal political landscape. That's what I'm a bit worried, and I think it's not really.
Let me ask you and Isnur as well. Is there anyone at a local government level, a bupati, for example, or a governor, that is trusted enough by some of the activist groups to play that kind of consolidating role? Isnur, that's for you too. Also, anybody else who wants to respond?
Yeah, I think very few, yeah. Very few, and the problem is they are also produced by the political party. It's relating to the central again in Jakarta. So what happened in the rural area? It's instruct and consolidating by the in the central of the agencies in Jakarta. The problem like that.
Yeah.
So yeah. But in momental in some of momentum, for example, in many area, so the governor or the bupati meet with the demonstrator and talking each other and decreasing and de-escalating the riot, yeah, just like that, but not committing on the agenda, changing the policy.
Yeah, that's the really difficult part. And without some figure, it's going to be very hard to push because you also need leverage to get some of these changes in place.
Yeah.
I don't know whether Rina is still online. Rina, are you there? If not, Ed, do you have any thoughts?
Well, no, I mean, I was just thinking I think we're putting our finger here on some of the particular problems that, we do find. And again, I mean, there's a lot to be incredibly inspired about by, despite the violence and the problem and many of the problems we're discussing. I mean, there is a great deal of hope, I think, in the sort of the energy which has been on display over the last couple of weeks, that it's not only been a very visible demonstration that there is still extremely deep and widespread widespread support amongst many sectors of Indonesian population for like making really positive political change. And some of the international or transnational solidarity that people have been referring to. And I should mention actually here that inadvertently I put a comment by Minji Lee talking about Korea into the answered part of the question and answer. So please have a look at that one. It's also interesting. But I think we are at a stage of sort of, so even like 10 years ago, I think people would have, Linda presumably would have answered that question a bit differently about whether there are individuals within the, you know, amongst parties and governors and so on, because this was a period when activists in civil society and academics, and Linda perhaps can even talk about this, that they were sort of building these sorts of connections into local politics, and there were parties here and there who were building these sorts of cooperative programs with local civil society activists. But now it really does feel like, you know, how I described it well before, as if there are these two separate worlds of Indonesian politics, which have really been growing apart. And the sort of connections that used to exist between those two worlds earlier in the Reformasi period have, to a large extent, been severed, I think.
But it's also interesting because in the 98 period, you had top members of the middle class not only supporting the downfall of Suharto, but also actively funding the movement. And that's going to be very different now with the middle class aligned pretty much solidly with the political elites.
Yeah.
Now we have a question, we have a couple of questions. We have one from Don Emerson, who wants to know whether those people who are supporting militarization in Indonesia, so those who support the TNI bill, those who support the return of Dwi Fungsi, those who support the extension of the military, do any of them take the US and what Trump is doing in the US as a model for their support? Anybody have any thoughts? Isnur?
Yeah.
Veronica?
Yes. Yeah, but it's like apa ya, manipulation campaign, I think. So yeah, you can build the campaign to support the government agenda. It's come a lot from buzzer, for example. So the buzzer, the influencer, apa ya, handling by the leader, by the hidden people, I think, and they came back to support the militarization and other agenda. So the people,
but it's not. But they're not drawing on the U.S. It's all from internally through Indonesia, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, they try also. It's our momentum because the Prabowo is military leader. So it's our momentum, the military momentum, to handling again a lot of field, business field, saving the people like that. So they have a lot of giving project by the government, meal free, the apa namanya, Merah Putih cooperation, and a lot of project give to the military team, I think.
Yeah, there's the question from Twinkle in the Philippines was about the comparisons with people power in 1986, when the military actually joined the civilians, or some aspects, some parts of the military joined the civilians in pressing their goals. Is there any chance, his question, that you would have that kind of alliance? Are there any factions or splits that would lead to support?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Because the military is very, very tough. The commander from the top to the bottom.
Yeah. Linda, any thoughts on that, or Veronica?
Yeah, and the problem also, we don't have the political party and the leaders from the elites opposition for Prabowo. They became
that's part of the problem. There isn't a political opposition. That's part of the problem with rainbow coalitions.
Yeah, even PDI Perjuangan is now joining the government alliance.
Yeah, yeah. Veronica or Linda or Rina, any comments?
Yeah, just a very quick comment. We are civil society try to push this bill on what is it, perampasan aset, basically, and
Illicit
that's really
enrichment. Illicit enrichment.
illicit
Illicit
engagement.
enrichment. Hmm.
Okay, so that's really a kind of key differences among the elite and the people, because that's really bind them together. They don't want to get, you know, taken away. So that's really make it really difficult to have this opposition, because even oppositions want to keep doesn't want to have that bill, draft bill. So I guess that's really
Yeah.
how, really the positioning this people, citizens, and to the elites because of that particular. So there's no way I think elite will, fragment it and support this draft bill. So I guess that's a no. And I want to also respond quickly to Don Emerson's point. I think that's really about nationalism, which is basically, again, is globally, is everywhere. You try to protect your economy, and I think Prabowo is exactly doing that. And he kind of play also as well between China and China and US, and play all the card. But still, if you label US as a asing, we hate them. Prabowo hate
Yeah.
asing. So I am an Isnur or whoever being inflicted by the idea is they hate it. I mean, this regime hate us. So we are asing basically. But of course, who are asing? So, but I think that also shows it's very much nationalistic, ideology that
Yeah.
already started since Jokowi.
And it was clear when Hendro Priano and the others started talking about pamain-asing that's a way of avoiding any kind of responsibility or accountability for what's actually taking place. There's an interesting question on the 17+8 struggle agendas. Given the number of these different points, what tactics can you use to get these on the public agenda? And do you have to cherry pick them? Do you have to pick and choose which of these multiple goals you focus on in order to get attention? Veronica, do you want to take that?
And that's a very challenging question. And yeah, there has been a lot of debate, I think, online about whether the 18+7 demand are realistic or not. But I think Indonesian now at the point where, like all the problems that they are facing today are this complicated. It intersect with so many different things, economic, political, cultural, and I think also religious. I think it's very clear in Indonesia right now, even religious organizations have been part of the ruling elite. So this is, I think, very difficult for the social movement or for the movement itself to, to define who the enemy are. I mean, of course, like Prabowo and all the DPR members, but I think there has been a lot of thought about what the demand should be. And it's very, I think there is a point earlier about including also what's happening in West Papua, but I think it's a process that I don't know, like I think people like Isnur who is on the ground like really know how difficult that is, like to narrow down all the demand into like this the 17 and 8, and of course it's not realistic in any way because of the culture, the system that we are facing today in Indonesia. But I think it become kind of like a tool, pedagogy tools for the oppressed, kind of for the
But
people.
there's also there have been successes of the civil society movement, and there have been times. One example is the sexual violence bill, which, after all the opposition from various Islamist organizations, conservative organizations, and so on, that bill got passed. Is there a way of taking a couple of draft laws and making those the target of particular campaigns. The problem is that you've got such dead wood in the parliament. But even at the time of that sexual violence bill, the parliament wasn't that much better. But it was a very systematic, focused campaign for a specific legislative outcome, and it worked. Now, it didn't work on the TNI law, but maybe the vested interests were too well entrenched. Anybody have any thoughts? Chris or Ed or Doreen?
Can I jumping in a bit there,
Yeah.
Sydney? I think I mapped the bill that getting successful and not looking from the civil society roles. And it's actually only bill that did not really, how to say it, tackle these issues of oligarchy that get through. Right. So
that's
you
important,
have this
important point.
You have this disability bill that works. You have this anti-sexual bill that also works. But if you talk about, Mas Isnur can mention so many other bills that doesn't work. It's just so difficult to pass through because there's a lot of barricade as well to stop them from coming through, right? So that's really a bit difficult if I mean, I agree that's a success and story that perhaps we can model from it and see whether we can do the same with other bill. But I think the material of this bill that also matters here. You cannot just assume that can we, because it's really different. Bill on, mining, it never worked since 2019. On KPK, it never worked, And it's also the role of civil society quite active there. ICW, Indonesian Corruption Watch. But again, a lot of barricades. So I guess I mean, we can also see this elite interest and citizen interest and the way that elite wants to protect them. And then we come to this theory of oligarchy, how they are basically strategy to defend themselves.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. I think when you get up against those interests, it's very, very hard to break through. Doreen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I've been really curious during this period, thinking about globally the trends. There have been sort of comparisons to authoritarianism elsewhere growing in the world, and there's this really useful article by Kim Chappell called Autocratic Legalism, which really describes how, for example, in countries like Hungary, democratic space is curtailed legally, right, through the instrumentalization of the law. And so what has been clear in Indonesia over the last decade or so is that repression happens when politicians get up there and say, if you have a problem with it, you just do a judicial review, because every citizen has the right to go to MK and ask for a judicial review, right? Without thinking of the barriers to actually produce any kind of meaningful change in legislation. So we see that, the language of, again, autocratic legalism is really there to facilitate the continuation of elite interests. And I will also say that one thing that is current right now, maybe the most favorite loan word from English to Indonesian right now is Nepo babies. We all know the problem are the Nepo babies, and that's part of the elite consolidation as well, is we can't think of a good candidate who would be an outstanding leader the way that, for example, Zoran Mamdani energized people in New York City just a few months ago, right? We can't think of someone who we would entrust our hopes for the future in that same way. And the main reason is the lack of transparency. So I'm really curious, maybe Isnur can answer this question of, is there a strategy in asking for transparency, for instance? Like, what are the bundles of legal strategies that activists can use to produce more transparency? It could be transparency on military budgets. It could be transparency on how much tear gas was bought, because there was a lot of tear gas used this year. in these demonstrations. And it might be different tear gas from what was used at Kanjuruhan, a few years ago. And so I'm wondering if there are legal strategies that will help grassroots movement produce some very pointed questions.
Okay, Isnur, have a quick response.
Yeah. About the 17 and plus 8, the demanding, I think this is a quick study summarizing the message and creativity compiled by content creators and influencer large following on social media. The same thing is now being conveyed by an alliance economic expert with 7 demands. I think it's the initiative, good initiative here. But I see these 17 and 8 demands as living documents that we must refine because there are many substantive shortcomings. We must also simplify it because there are so many demands. The public confused with these demands. There is currently a lot of consolidation and meetings being held by civil society. Mbak Amalinda, now every week we have a consolidation in many areas. Ultimately, I see leadership not as coming from individuals or institution. For example, while Gadjah, please lead us, but come from narrative. But so we led by narrative, and the situation must be expected to continue in the long term, because I find it difficult to believe that Prabowo administration and DPR will change and improve. So it's time for us to prepare a better communication, better consolidation, better leadership in civil society. Thank you.
What do you mean by it must be led by narrative?
Yeah, maybe in the past, Bang Buyung or YB judge as a locomotive democracy, led us as the horse flag with the white flag, go maju gitu. But now different when the people trying to convincing with 17 plus 8 demands. So we are leading by the narrative like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I have to ask the organizers: were we supposed to end at 90 minutes or 2 hours?
90 minutes is probably a good moment, especially thinking of the folks on the East Coast of the US and the hour that it is.
Okay, so I think we'll have to bring it to a close, but can I just get one more question? Because 2 people have asked a question about the role of the Labor Party in the context. They were the leaders of the labor demonstration on the 28th. And the question is whether they have any role going forward, since they're clearly not represented in the DPR. Anybody have any thoughts? Final answer?
It's really Linda who should respond to that one. She knows the Labour Party pretty well.
Linda, do they have any hope? Future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issues of precarity is getting more important now and very, very present in public. And that's kind of opportunity for the Labour Party to take in or to tap into that discussion and debate. And I think it is indeed has a very strong potential. But it's very potential, but it needs to broaden up their support. And that's, I think, what's Labour Party is doing now, a lot of homework, but they're trying to get younger people, precarity group in the urban area, the ojol and all that. So they are working and they try to be inclusive too, because they are very known to be male dominated and very much into that patriarchal style of old style of union. So I think they are working really hard for that. So I guess for 2029 and also for the local election 2031, if there are any elections, I'm really scared now.
Okay.
So that's really, I think it's a very strong potential. That's my take on it.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the wonderful speakers and discussants and people who put questions on the chat here. I hope we have a follow-up on this and we can continue the discussion maybe in a couple of months to see where things have moved since then. But thank you all. Have a good evening, and we'll try to write up the results of this and send it around. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.